the floor to Mitchell and Kenyon, please.
Thank you very much. I want to start by setting the stage with this question. So we know that sentences in one, the pair there is string identical and conveys the same information, but are acceptable in different contexts, right? Alex gave Brie a flower versus Alex gave Brie a flower. There's a parallel contrast in two where we added this word only, and actually now it leads to a truth conditional difference. So the position of pitch accent here seems to co-vary with a difference in interpretation. So in common terms, they differ in the position of focus. So the position of focus affects multiple modules of grammar. As we saw, it affects the phonology, it affects the semantics, and as we'll see later today in detail, it affects the morphosyntax. So there's this overall problem we could ask, which is this correspondence problem. How do we explain these correlations between phonology, semantics, and syntax? So a classic approach is this idea of F marking. So from Jackendorf Semantics and Generative Grammar, he says one artificial construct is required, a syntactic marker F, which can associate with any node in the surface structure. Two systems of rules will make use of the marker F, and the semantics, one in the semantics, one in the phonology. So in a modern setting, we can call this the F feature that is annotated somehow in the narrow syntax, adjoined to some structure, and then that feeds interpretation at both PF and LF. So going back to the sentences we started with, we think of these as sentences that vary in the position of this F marking, and then we can then read that information off at the interfaces. In the phonology, that F marking may be reflected in the prosody. For example, in English and languages like that, every F marked constituent bears a pitch accent. In the semantics as well, F marking indicates the logical focus, which is to say the position of variation across a set of alternatives that are then used for the interpretation of certain focus sensitive operators, like focus particles, also for discourse congruence, etc. This syntactic F marking has been called the standard GB minimalist approach to focus in Krista Sendro's paper, and it remains so today. But it's not without criticism. For example, it's been noted that this insertion of F in the narrow syntax violates the inclusiveness condition, for example. Some have therefore entertained, for this reason and others, other models of focus correspondence that don't utilize F marking, and we'll come back to this later in this talk today. But after reviewing F marking and F-less theories, Krista's paper notes that neither of the approaches can be favored over the other on purely conceptual grounds. So in order to give us an empirical grounding, today we're going to start by reframing the debate around this question in 6, the syntactic reality question. Are there morphosyntactic processes that can make reference to F marking? If there are, then great. Then our work is done, or at least much easier, right? This classic picture from the past 50 years, we can sit comfortably with that. But if we realize there is no syntactic F marking, then we then have to really seriously pursue and adopt that F-less approach to focus phenomena. So what will happen today is that first I'll present the yes position, and then we'll go to the no position. Kenyon will present that. And then sort of switching gears and hats a little bit, we'll go back to me and we'll talk a bit about what that F-less world might look like. So let's get started. So the position here is that there is F marking in the syntax. So I want to try to convince you and Kenyon of this position, right? In particular, here, I'm going to highlight 3 morphosyntactic processes that seem to clearly target F marking, right? F gets attracted for movement, it gets agreed with, and it gets retained under ellipsis in fragments. So first is focus movement. So it's well known that many languages have constructions that have where focused phrases move to some dedicated position. For example, in the clefts in English in 7b and 7c, right? That's an exhaustive focus construction where the focus moves to a dedicated position. Similarly, an exhaustive focus construction in Hungarian famously involves obligatory movement to this dedicated preverbal position. And movement is a syntactic operation. We need to find a target to move. We can do that by looking at what has an F mark. Now, I want to immediately note that, of course, we know that the relationship between what gets moved and what's logically the focus, what's F marked, is not exactly one-to-one. There is a mismatch. In particular, there's a well-known mismatch of Pied piping. So we know that we can actually move something that is logically larger than the thing that's the logical focus. Now, that being said, I don't think that seriously challenges the approach that we need F marking in the grammar. In particular, when we look at how in the existing literature we deal with Pied piping, there are broadly two approaches, but one is you start with that F feature and then somehow percolate it up, right? Somehow get it up to a higher position and then move that. Or there's this relatively newer particle-based approach where there is some particle that adjoins to some structure. That's what you're actually moving, except then we also have to explain the relationship between the particle placement and the F. So there has to be a relatively local relationship there. Either way, both of these approaches still make reference to F marking. The second empirical phenomenon I want to highlight is focus agreement. So movement is not the only type of syntactic reference to focus that exists. In fact, phi agreement can target focus as well. And I want to here highlight some data which is, to our knowledge, not very well known or discussed from the Papuan language Lavukaleve, which has certain focus particles which inflect for the phi features of their focus. So here, the data in 3 all involve a narrow focus construction with the F marking indicated and reflected in the translation. And what we see is that in these focus constructions, there's a sentence final H series focus marker that appears that inflects for the phi features of that focused constituent. And the focused constituent is an object in 11A, it's a subject in 11B, it's a prepositional object in 11C, right? It doesn't matter exactly what kind of thing it is. This is not normal subject or object agreement, which the language has, but it is specifically targeting the focused constituent, right? And we can get this if we have F marking, right? So the existence of F feature targeting phi agreement, I think really significantly strengthens the argument for F being in the syntax. So maybe for focus movement, there are approaches that say that you can explain it because this is not exactly syntactic movement, or it's less syntactic. It's motivated by prosodic requirements to try to align something with a prosodic edge. Maybe something like that makes sense for focus movement. But really for phi agreement, the choice of phi target, this really seems like you need to have a syntactic feature there to target. Phi agreement is a syntactic process par excellence. It's a product of some kind of operation like agree. And there are a lot of phi targets in these sentences we just saw. So just probing for phi is insufficient. You have to specifically target F and then copy back its phi features. And there might be different technical ways of doing that, but we need to refer to F somehow. The third empirical phenomenon is fragments. So we know that fragments can be interpreted as if they have their corresponding clausal interpretation. And in fact, a widely adopted approach to fragments is to actually treat them as underlyingly clausal, but having undergone ellipsis. Now, under this widely adopted approach, there are broadly 2 sub-approaches. One involves movement of the focused constituent and then deletion of the clause, or another type of approach where the focus stays in situ and we somehow delete the surrounding clause. We'll hear a lot more about that later today. But in either case, we need to have some syntactic reference to the logical focus. So just to summarize my position, syntactic processes clearly make reference to a focus feature, right? The logical focus gets this F, it gets attracted for movement, it gets agreed with, it gets retained under ellipsis. And as a bonus, this is a world we want to live in. It's comfortable, right? If we know that F exists in the syntax, the correspondence problem is much easier, right? And so we can be done now, right?
No, we can't. So what I'm going to do here is introduce 2, I think, new to the audience empirical challenges against F marking in the syntax. So the first comes from another class of mismatches between what's marked as being the focus and what's logically interpreted as such. This is going to motivate a closer look at the role of particles in the grammar, and I think it's going to motivate a version of the theory of one of the theories Mitcho mentioned before that involves particles being placed in the syntax as, you know, the driving force for focus movement, but without any reference to what would traditionally be called F marks. So I'll give you a sort of sketch of a proposal of what this would look like, and then rebut some of the nice cases that you just showed us where syntactic processes seem to make reference to F as a syntactic feature. I'll then go on to show you some facts about secondary fronting and pied piping, where we see that there are systematic differences in behavior between WH elements, something that has been thought of to be closely related to focus, but can also be clearly seen as an inherent property of lexical items in at least some languages, and focus that I think present a pretty strong challenge to the position that F as a syntactic feature is real. Then after you've all been convinced, we'll go back and forth and discuss what an F-less world might look like. So here's another mismatch. It comes, me and some other guy have called this anti-pied piping. So we've already seen that there are these morphosyntactic processes that putatively target an F-marked element, and sometimes they target another element nearby as in pied piping. So that's schematized in 15. What we see there abstractly is that there's something that is targeted for some syntactic process, and within it, maybe it's particle placement, maybe it's movement, and then within it, it contains the focus. It turns out there's another form of mismatch schematized in 16 called anti-pied piping, where the subscripts are reversed. You have something that is logically interpreted as the focus, but you attach a particle to or move something properly contained within it. For pied piping, there are ways of talking about this using things like feature percolation, but it's much harder to do this with anti-pied piping, and the argument's pretty short, so I'll go through that in a bit. So here's what this looks like. In 17, we have an example of this in Japanese. In 18, we have an example of this from Hungarian. So in 17, there are these two contrastive chunks in each conjunct, roughly corresponding to TP or little VP, that contain a good chunk of the verb and both of the arguments. So you have this large chunk of the verb phrase that's of the clause that's being contrasted, yet it's the subject of each of these conjuncts that's marked, rather than having a particle appear somewhere in the verbal complex, which in a head final language like Japanese certainly would not be surprising to find, and in some cases plausibly you do find non-mismatches of the sort you might expect. Something similar is going on in Hungarian. In the Hungarian example in 18, here you have two VPs being marked contrastively. We mentioned before that there's movement of a focused element to a preverbal position. You might expect nothing to move. It's the verb phrase itself that's focused, but what we see instead is that in the first conjunct, it's the object that moves to this preverbal position. So what we see in each case is that there's some morphosyntactic strategy for marking focus, targeting a proper subpart of what's logically interpreted as being focused. And this isn't a weird quirk of Japanese and Hungarian, which might have the additional weird quirk of being well studied by linguists. If you go look around in grammars, it turns out patterns like these are remarkably widespread. So we've done this and we found that these patterns arise in about 50 languages from 30 distinct genera all over the world. Like it's super common. Languages do this all the time. So there's no existing theory particularly of the F marking with percolation sort that I'm aware of that can account for patterns like these. So if you're just trying to probe for a focus feature, somewhere in the structure, maybe that feature could percolate downwards, but you would still always find that highest thing. You run into basically an A/A problem. So in particular for the movement cases, these patterns are a real challenge. But I think more generally, when you consider the range of mismatches that are attested, we could make the claim that there really aren't morphosyntactic processes that target focus that don't tolerate these sorts of mismatches, that always target specifically the logical focus as determined semantically, or as would be determined by an F feature on something in the syntax. So we'd want a theory where all morphosyntactic reference to focus is in fact indirect. And I'll give you sort of a sketch of what this might look like, even though I haven't figured the details out myself. So let's go back to the role of particles, this other class of theories for doing for morphosyntactically marking focus, following Horvath and Capel in their work on pied piping. So we can make this sort of analytical claim following the empirical claim that I just made, that all apparent morphosyntactic reflexes of focus involve probing for or identifying a particle phrase and not the logical focus. So particle phrases would be adjoined, by adjoining some particle, small caps PRT, I'll just say particle for the rest of this conversation, to some constituent. These particles might be unpronounced, as would be in the Hungarian case, following Horvath and Capel. Furthermore, the particle itself might be semantically inert with some corresponding operator adjoined in the clausal spine, which introduces the corresponding semantics. This ends up being kind of crucial for modeling anti-pipe piping, where, on this view, there's no expectation that the particle's history is the focus or even contains the focus. Go read that paper if you're interested in finding out more.
Thanks.
So we do, of course, have to explain the fact that particles do seem to adjoin directly to the logical focus, and that some mismatches aren't tolerated, and then we need to explain where particles can and can't go. So I've introduced a sort of new problem, which I'll get back to at some point, which is, if you have a structure, a portion of which may be focused, how does the grammar know where to adjoin a particle within it without F marking? And this is a non-trivial problem. For the rest of this conversation, which I think can proceed without needing this to be explicitly spelled out, once we solve it, if we can, in a manner that allows for the observed mismatches, all of the apparently focus targeting morphosyntactic processes that you just mentioned can be cashed out again as referring to the output of this process, which crucially makes no reference to an F mark in the syntax that has both semantic and phonological ramifications. So if a particle theory like this can exist, and I think it can, this will end up diffusing all of the arguments for F marking that you just mentioned without needing to reference this particular feature. So the way, sort of abstractly, this would work is you have your derivation. At some point, the particle is introduced into the structure, so you could have no mismatch where the thing that the particle is adjoined to ends up being interpreted as being focused. You could have pipe piping where the thing that the particle is adjoined to ends up containing the focus, or you could have anti-pipe piping, which are cases where the particle is adjoined within the focus, and is sort of a logical subpart of it. There's a fourth one that you might be guessing at. I'll get back to that later. In this sort of world, we can talk about those things that you mentioned in just the same way. So focus movement could, just be movement targeting the particle phrase, following Horvath and Cable, but also allowing for the anti-pipe piping cases that involve movement, with the particle just being unpronounced in some languages or not being realized segmentally. As for focus agreement, well, yeah, agreement targets the particle phrase. So returning to Lavuca-Levy and looking at a set of facts that might be even less well known, it turns out that Lavuca-Levy also has a set of constituent focus particles, the F series, as we see in 25A and 25B, they're bolded, which adjoin here to the focus and also agree with it in 5 features. This sentence final H marker could simply probe for the particle phrase. Maybe it's expressed overtly, sometimes maybe it's not, and then phi agree with it. If you're looking at the handout, there are a bunch of different ways you could imagine doing this. Exactly how you want to cache that out, I think, is a project to pursue once we can find more Lavuca-Levy speakers. And then for fragments and ellipsis, you just, fragment answers allow mismatches such as pipe piping, and you can model this by taking fragment formation to be sensitive to particle phrases. Could be non-constituent ellipsis, could be movement. Take your pick, whichever one ends up being correct. So in this world, all apparent reference to focus within the syntax can and really should be recast in terms of reference to particle phrases. The range of mismatches that we get here is what we would expect in a world where there's no F marking in syntax. You just place your particle and hope that the interpretation ends up being right, however you want to spell out your interpretive set of rules. Of course, we'll need to explain particle placement, putting that aside for now. So now that we're living in this particle world where F is not real, where there are no F features in the syntax, I want to try and build another argument to convince you that this is the right way of thinking about things, that we really want a particle placement theory that doesn't have F at all. So in an F-less world, F is not a feature of lexical items, nor is it added specifically to the logical focus. It's just something that the syntax doesn't truck in. But sort of relatedly, we might think of WH as being a lexical feature, an inherent property of some lexical items in at least some languages. So we might expect there to be differences between things that are focused and things that are WHE, in that there might be operations that really just pick out WH elements and don't allow pipe piping at all. And I think this will show you that this is real. So there's a process called secondary fronting and pipe piping. People around 2010 were interested in it, and they made a couple of generalizations about it. So an example of this is shown in 26. This is a relative clause in French. We fronted this entire prepositional phrase to the left edge of the relative clause, and then within that phrase, the relative operator has moved to its edge. So it turns out that secondary fronting of this sort doesn't pipe, and it applies to WH movement, but not focus movement. So starting off with point one, we're going to look at Tzatzil, robustly head initial language. In 27, we have an intransitive verb and then a complex subject. It has a possessor, which itself has a possessor. For sentences like this, if you want to ask a WH question about the most deeply embedded possessor, you do something like 28. You front the entire thing, so the language has piping, but you don't pipe, and then you move the WH element to the edge of that DP, but you don't do this recursively. This process of secondary fronting really just picks out the WH element. If you try and move the WH element to the edge of the phrase that it's in a local possession relationship with, and then pipe that to the edge, that's out. It's 28A and 28B. So this contrast shows that although Tzatzil certainly does allow piping in WH movement, the secondary fronting within the pipe constituent doesn't allow piping, which again follows straightforwardly in this world. If piping involves movement of a particle phrase, but secondary movement targets specifically something bearing a WH feature. So spelling this out a bit more, suppose there's a particle merged to the WH containing DP in cases of piping, that's 29. This particle might be specified to probe for something that bears WH features, which would give you the secondary fronting process with a higher particle, probe for particle phrases, attracting the entire particle phrase, that's 31. So secondary fronting targets WH, so only the WH element moves. Piping is impossible since the particle isn't looking for another particle phrase, but specifically WH. And then the primary fronting itself, of course, is movement of the particle phrase, as we would just sort of generally say for cases of piping in this theory. Now, note, following everything I've said, that secondary fronting in 30 was possible due to probing by the particle for WH, for an inherent feature of the WH element of the possessor. So what we should expect is that secondary fronting of focus should not be possible because F is not a syntactic feature. The syntax just doesn't get to make reference to that information. So there are a lot of languages that have secondary fronting with WH movement where it's been noted that there's no corresponding secondary fronting in focus movement. So I'm going to use a Zapotec example to show you this. 32 is the one where 32 is just sort of a basic transitive clause in the language. And we're interested in the last DP in the clause. So it has a relational noun and a possessor which follows it. If you want to ask something about, who your mom is angry with, you front that entire phrase headed by the relational noun, and then within it, the WH element undergoes secondary fronting, following the same process that I just mentioned before. But if you want to answer that question, as in 34, you front that phrase, but you don't front the logical focus within it, and in fact, you can't. So that's the contrast between 34A and 34B. And it's not just a funny fact of the Zapotec. Secondary fronting in WH movement, but not in focus movement, has been explicitly observed in a number of other languages. So Trique does this, Quiche does this, and another fairly unrelated Zapotec does this as well. And I bet if people who aren't Broadwell go and study these languages, they'll find the same thing. So this pervasive distinction between WH elements and logically focused elements is exactly the sort of thing that we would expect in a world without F marking, where there is no F feature in the syntax. Particles might be specified to probe for a WH feature, an inherent property of certain lexical items, triggering so-called secondary fronting. Were there F marking in the syntax, we might just as well expect there to be languages where the particle is able to attract, something that is F marked, giving you secondary fronting in these cases, but you don't. And this is the sort of thing that we can explain immediately, right? It's an impossible lexical item. You can't have a particle that probes for focus because there's no focus feature in the syntax. You're just not allowed to, write a grammar that does that. So sort of summing up, there are these mismatches in syntactic reference to focus that are worse than we might have thought. That I think motivates an abandonment of syntactic reference to F with the relationship between where you place your marker of focus and what is interpreted as being logically focused, however you want to cash that out, you need to have that be a fairly indirect relationship. And then the behavior of secondary fronting, I think, really suggests that if there were an F feature, it's not behaving like things that we would clearly, want to say are features, are inherent properties of lexical items like WH. And then, all of the cases that you have where some syntactic process is apparently referring to focus can be cashed out, in using a particle theory like I just spelled out. Return.
Well, so this is very convincing. So personally, right, so the arguments that were presented, right, certainly seem to diffuse the arguments for direct reference to F in the syntax, right? It seems like maybe we can get away with particle phrases if we know where to put them. And the second argument in particular does seem to strongly suggest that there really is a difference between F and something semantically very similar, but lexically different, WH, right? That being said, I should object here, right? This F-less position, this heterodox position needs to account for the basic facts, right? We need to explain the correspondence between phonology, semantics, and syntax. So, and just to unpack that again and break it down a little bit, one part of this, again, is what we started with. It's that correspondence between the semantics and pronunciation in many languages that gets you a contrast like here in 35. And in addition, now under this view, where we don't have F marks, now we have this new problem that was identified, that particle placement problem, as in 36. So just to articulate this, for example, if we have an intended interpretation where we want to vary some alternatives over the goal, the indirect object, then, and we want to put a particle only, a constituent particle only in here, why is the result 36A and not 36B, right? How does the grammar know to do that, right? Those are the questions we are going to have to answer in this world. So I'm now going to walk us through what might get us to an F-less world, what that F-less world might look like. And now might be a good place to just sort of let the audience know. This is not entirely a charade, but this is a reflection of a true debate that we've had over the past year. But the end result is I've become somewhat convinced, and I think that we really should take this seriously and push on it. And so this is our current, very much work in progress sketch of what that might look like. So again, we have these two questions. We have the semantic correspondence problem, and then we have the particle placement problem. And let me walk you through what we've been thinking about. So for the semantic correspondence, let's step back first and remind ourselves what the point of focus sensitivity was in the first place, right? So certain semantic operations, certain phenomena need to identify a set of alternatives to quantify over. And what we call focus is that position of variation across those alternatives. And it's really important to recognize that these are not exactly the same thing. In particular, the exact set of alternatives is always actually really underdetermined in at least two ways. So first is that given the surface form, the exact position of focus is very often underdetermined by that. So here's a long example from early Chomsky, but this has been widely known. Given a particular surface representation, metrically annotated, for example, the exact choice of F marking sometimes can be extremely underdetermined. And so an idea that has been developed based in response to that idea is there is this literature that has thought not about starting with F-marked syntactic structures and then figuring out the phonology, but instead, let's try starting with phonological representations, for example, with metrical or prosodic information annotated, and then allow that to restrict the possible positions of focus, or in other words, the possible sets of alternatives that we could be considering there. And so here are a number of citations for different approaches to doing exactly this. The second way in which the set of alternatives is often very underdetermined is that even if we know the position of focus, we still don't know exactly the set of alternatives that we're talking about. And we can see this in the contrast in 38 and 39, right? We can ask, where in Europe have you been before? I've only been to Berlin. Where in Germany have you been before? I've only been to Berlin. even though that second utterance seems to really be syntactically and phonologically exactly the same. Because they're uttered in these different discourse contexts, the truth conditions and entailments of these sentences actually are strikingly different. And so this already hints at an approach, which is that we can look at the discourse and let that discourse information inform our idea of what the set of alternatives is. So more specifically, there is this idea, notably by Roberts and Beaver and Clark, that actually everything that seems to be focus sensitive, to make reference to a set of alternatives, actually is always making reference to some questions under discussion. And therefore, this can be that can partially, at least partially, determine the set of alternatives that we get. And we're going to have to worry a little bit at the edges about what things count as QUDs and whether they can be implicit. But given that, we can use the discourse at least to inform what set of alternatives we should be looking at. So with these two ideas, looking at the phonology and looking at the discourse, we think that we can actually get a long way towards triangulating, if not exactly knowing, but triangulating what the set of alternatives in any case should look like without any direct reference to the position of focus in the syntax. And now all of this that we've presented has been a sort of phonology first model, but in a production context, if we start with an intended meaning, we might imagine that we try different phonological choices and use the heuristics that we had above as a filter on those output representations. Now, does this get us all the way to solving the problem of the phonology, semantics, correspondences, and focus? We're not sure. And so we're sort of open to talking more about this as well. We'd love to get opinions from the audience. Now let's talk about the syntax semantics or syntax phonology side correspondences. How do we get specifically particle placement without F marking? And the idea here is that we want to try to build this also based on the phonology. So suppose that we start with, again, a sort of metrically annotated or sort of prosodified tree. Now, a particle might adjoin to a particular prosodically prominent position. In particular, one very quick, brief statement might be that a particle adjoins to a constituent that's aligned with a phonological prominent word. So in our currently ongoing revision to this anti-pied piping paper, we have a definition of alignment, which gets us the behavior that we think is observed specifically for apparent leftmost requirements or preferences in pied piping and anti-pied piping cross-linguistically across a wide range of languages that we can account for if you're making reference to that prosodic information and choosing where to put the particle. Particles may also additionally try to avoid attaching to certain kinds of material, like given material or deaccented material. And then we would want to know, right, is that information that's really available at this timing in the architecture, right? So that's an open question. Now, this approach that starts with the phonological information and predicts particle placement, this might make certain predictions about how particle placement might be different in different languages with different prosodic reflexes of focus. And that seems to be true. So here's one striking example from Gamo, which is a Chadic language that has focus particles that can appear in various positions in the clause, independent apparently of where the focus is. So this is a focus particle, yak or yaki in 41, that can appear in any of these positions and give us the exact same interpretation. Now, notably, interestingly, Ngamo is a language that doesn't have prosodic reflexes of focus. And so if particle placement is really determined by a phonological representation, as we've suggested, then in a language that really doesn't have corresponding prosodic or phonological reflexes of focus, then there would be a very impoverished sort of representation that one could make reference to when deciding where to put particles. And that might give us a behavior like 40. Now, we also want to ask, right, how can particle placement refer to the phonology if then the output, what we've claimed under the position Kenyon introduced, right, the output, in other words, particle phrases are exactly what feeds the syntax. Remember that in the position that Kenyon introduced, all of the syntactic references to apparent syntactic references to syntax are actually references to particle phrases. So you have to be able to target them for syntax, how does that work if we just totally post-syntactically insert particles? So our answer to that would be, it's not entirely post-syntactic, but it happens at certain punctuated points in the derivation. In particular, particle placement can take place during cyclic spellout by phase. So when a phase undergoes spellout, a number of things happens, but so something that happens is the pronunciation of terminal nodes, their word order, and prosodic phrasing is calculated. There's a lot of evidence for that happening cyclically by phase. And at least a draft representation of this information is calculated. And then at that moment, we can then later join a particle into that phase, into that structure, making reference to this draft phonological information. And then that ends this cycle that happens at spellout for this phase, but then the particle's inserted, and in higher phases, you can make reference to that particle phrase, probe for it, move it, etc. And we spell this out in a little bit more detail again in that anti-pied piping paper, but we think that this actually might make very interesting and positive architectural predictions as well. For example, if particle phrases generally are the way that we describe A-bar movement, then this is going to put a floor on when particles can get introduced and when A-bar movement can start happening, et cetera, and might teach us about how to think about A-bar movement more generally. So just to conclude now, right, in this debate of sorts, we have presented these two positions, and I have conceded that I think there are compelling reasons to suggest that there may be no F marking in the syntax. In other words, there's no syntactic feature annotating the logical focus. But if we adopt that, if we are convinced by that, which I now tend to be, that puts us in a really scary place, I think. It puts what I thought initially was it puts us in a very scary place, right? It forces us to abandon the widely adopted F marking approach, schematized sort of in its information in 41, and instead more aggressively pursue an F-less theory of grammar and nonetheless account for all of these observed correspondences. In the last section, we tried to sketch the sort of work in progress approach we've been taking, which might be described as a sort of phonology first and interleaved syntax phonology first approach to this. And that's sort of schematized in 42, but that might not be the only way that we can rethink the architectural considerations here as well. Finally, we'll note that today we've really just concentrated on the question of F marking and with some relation to WH, but we should also be asking the same question of syntactic reality as determined by direct non-mismatching reference in the syntax. We should also be turning this lens, asking this question of other purported information structural features like topic, contrastive topic, givenness, etc. So that's where we are. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your timely presentation. Before I open up the floor for questions, I would like to just add a few issues that I would like to perhaps invite the debaters to discuss, or whether maybe there's related questions that that link to those. So there's only just 3 areas that I thought should be brought up in a discussion like this. One is, you mentioned the inclusiveness condition, and I just want to bring that up one more time in the sense that the inclusiveness condition basically states that only lexical properties can be introduced into the syntax, and F marking, whether it refers to prosodic prominence or to focus, is going to violate that. And in fact, Chomsky has a footnote about this where he says that although he believes the syntax between the numeration and LF to be free of such considerations, he's aware of the fact that PF is never going to work that way. So, you know, maybe you're bringing in prosody actually sort of speaks to that, that issue. The other 2 are more empirical points. So I just wanted to raise a few configurational puzzles. So there are certain configurations that are notoriously difficult to deal with a syntactic marker. Obviously, there are cases that lend themselves very easily to dealing with those. So one is, for instance, what Daniel Buring called discontinuous focus, where the examples would be something like, what did you do with the books? I sent the books to Kim. The feeling we get is that sent and to Kim are both part of the focus, whereas the books is given or not part of the focus. So how do you deal with such an issue with, if you have folk F marking, that's sort of an issue. There's also what we call Superman sentences in the paper that Ad Neleman and I published in 2004. That also gives you a configuration that's hard to deal with in a syntactic F marking situation. And finally, I just want to bring up some typological issues. Maybe it brings up other questions. There are some statements that I think are quite often can be considered true or close to true. So one is, if a language has nuclear stress, it is always associated with focus marking. I don't know of any language that has nuclear stress and it's not marking focus. In fact, it seems to me to be a stronger statement is even true that if a language has nuclear stress, then focus is actually always marked, like in every sentence, which again points to the importance of prosody. And finally, if focus movement is often optional and it does not often come with a clear interpretative difference, again, this is an issue for F marking. And the final issue is covered focus movement. I think it's crucial that covered focus movement is demonstrated very clearly if prosody is not supposed to be involved in the picture. Okay, so I just want to raise these issues, bring them up in case they trigger some thoughts. I don't know if you feel like you would like to react to them at this point, or whether I should just go on and call in some questions from the audience.
Is there a bit of it that you want to touch on, or?
Nothing comes immediately to mind, although the observation about languages that have clear overt prosodic marking of focus, always marking focus, is I think that's an interesting thing, at least for me to think about. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I would like to call on, first of all, Laura Kalin or Kalin. I don't know how to pronounce your name. Could you unmute yourself and ask your question first?
Yeah, so thank you for that very clear, nice talk. So I want to ask you how you would account for some recent findings by Branan, Craig Saylor, and Sanu Jung. I don't know if you're aware of these. I think it was WICFL most recently they gave a talk at, and what they're interested in are patterns that they call stray focus stress, which is where stress shows up on, like, in a really surprising place and an unstressed syllable of something that is fully outside the domain of F marking or focus, however whether there's F marking or not. So just to give you a quick example, this is from his handout. So if person A says to person B, it looks like we'll be late to the party, person B can say, yeah, apparently, like if they know that their train is running late or something, or they think their train might be running late, or yeah, probably we'll be late to the party, when it's like we will be late to the party is really what's under focus. And I can't really wrap my head around, at least on the fly, how the particle account could potentially, account for this, because if there, isn't syntactic focus, I mean, if it's just a regular particle and it gets elided, why should its prosody get to survive ellipsis and get lodged somewhere else? Whereas if you think there really is something like syntactic F marking, then if that triggers a corresponding prosodic realization, you could imagine, it's not just a run-of-the-mill lexical item that gets elided, it has this separate prosodic life that might survive the ellipsis of the syntactic material. So, thank you.
Should I say something?
You can go first, and then I can chime in.
Yeah. So thank you for bringing that up. I think it had come across my desk, but I don't think we engaged with. I don't think I engaged with it fully. But at least just based on those examples, I think that actually the sort of F-less world and that kind of architecture that we mentioned actually might fare better for accounting for that kind of data, right? Because there isn't necessarily an expectation under this view, right? The mapping between exactly what semantically should be the focus and what actually ends up bearing some pitch accent in English, for example, is not necessarily it's really not predicted to be that transparent, right, under this view, right? Because you don't have a direct reference to a thing that logically is the focus when you decide what your phonology is. And so I could imagine different ways that you could get exactly the kind of mismatch and under certain circumstances. And then under our sort of particle view, right? So once you have a mismatch in the sort of phonology and the semantics, then our view would be then that what you do, for example, retain in a fragment, in these fragment answers, say, would follow the phonology. It would follow whatever then bears pitch accent, then that's what gets retained for ellipsis in this case, say. And that seems to be what happens here, right?
Yeah, sort of chiming in, it could be that what these facts are showing us is that, lots of languages behave like Ngamo when you press them to, that you can get these complete mismatches between what's, what you might think of as marking focus and what you actually interpret as being focused. It's just for some languages you have to try a little harder.
Okay, thank you. Our next question will come from Paul Wooltred. Would you like to unmute yourself, Paul?
Yeah, I'm Waltraud, don't worry. Krista, don't worry. In fact, I have a more general problem with both approaches. If you your comment on the Japanese example 17, where you show a kind of mismatch between what is morphologically marked by this particle more, which means also, and where you put the F marking, which are which are the entire sentences. Hanako entered college and Fujiko got married. So here, all of a sudden, F marking, in fact, doesn't do anything then mark two contrasting elements. So in fact, your approach, both the F-less and the F marking approach, kind of mix together only focus, cleft focus, because you had examples of English cleft focus. Then you get in with WH movement. I mean, if your F marking covers all these different phenomenon, contrastiveness, WH, cleft focus, only focus, then in fact it's very easy for the F-less approach to show that these are heterogeneous phenomena. And so no wonder the F-less approach can say, hey, be careful, WH movement and focus movement do not coincide. So this is one general problem. And then I don't see at all how an F-less approach with this kind of particle deus ex machina, whose precise categorical status you are very discreet about, how can an F-less approach account for cleft focus constructions using the copula like B in English, when in fact the syntactic configuration which gives you the focus. So, well, okay, I probably had more questions, but I got confused in the end by a lot of material.
Well, sorry if that was confusing, Vali, but thank you for—
What was confusing? No, it was too rich in the end. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Well, then I'm glad it wasn't confusing. Just to clarify, right, a bit about this kind of data. I mean, I think, for example, like the example in 17 for, there's a lot of background that here for our presentation we just didn't include, namely what exactly the semantics of mo does here, which is when you have sort of contrasting phrases that have additive semantics, you can sort of satisfy them by putting mo on both parts in conjunctions, for example. And that's possible with a lot of different size kind of material. But here, clearly, it's not just narrowly the focus being, the subjects, for example. That's the point actually of why Kuroda talked about these examples. And for all of these other ones too, these examples that we have, and there are a lot more in this anti-pied piping paper that we have, there's a lot more work that is done to sort of establish what semantically is the focus, which we determine by actually looking at the semantics of the focus particle or the focus construction, of which there are many, right? And we're relying in many cases on other people's descriptions for that. But based on that, we determine what the focus is. And then we notice, oh, look, the syntactic process that makes reference to that somehow is targeting something that's not exactly that. That's how we.
May I just throw in one sentence? I mean, I'm not hitting on that sentence especially. It's F marking being extended to contrastiveness, which is a general problem with focus being extended to contrastiveness. So it's independent of the Japanese example.
Okay, Vali, maybe we can talk about this later. I want to understand.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. Our next question will come from Sikai Lee. I hope I pronounce your name properly.
Yeah. Hi, Mitchell. Hi, Kenyon. So I'd like to take a look at the very last diagram you had. And I think my question will be related to what Martina posted in the chat as well. Right. So looking at this correspondence without F marking, you start from phonology, and that leads into semantics. And my question there is similar to what Martina posted in the chat again, because why is this the directionality that you have to assume, right? Because I'm thinking from the production side of things, it seems like the semantics will inform the phonology rather than the other way around. So why can't you have something that looks more like 41 and just call it something other than F? Whatever is conditioning the phonology is also what's conditioning the insertion of the particle.
Why are you drinking water? This for you.
So I mean, I think the point is that oftentimes the particle doesn't and really can't be contributing to the semantics, at least not directly. So bringing it back, I think, to the Japanese example that we were just looking at, you don't want to say that, the particle is directly feeding the semantics, right? And it clearly can, unless you're doing, a lot of work to get your, semantic operator to somehow take scope over something that contains it. I think that's one reason that motivates this. I think some of the leftness effects that we had, less time to discuss, are much easier to talk about if you allow the syntax to be informed by the phonology, at least to some extent, rather than doing it the other way around.
So I think the first part, sorry, I threw that on you. I think the first part of that answer was mostly, in response to why can't we keep the 41 picture, but call it something different, right? Yeah, and right. I mean, and in part, I mean, that's also just because we then should be worried about, okay, then we talk about this new annotation, but exactly, what do we, how is that different than the architecture we started to consider, right? Or that Jack and Duff, put forward. More narrowly, going back to your question about the relationship between semantics and phonology in 42. So I guess, I mean, I think I agree that potentially could be a more sort of bi-directional relationship. And that's the way that we described it is here, right? We sketched this as you have a phonological representation and you take that and then based on that, decide what kinds of semantic representations might be relevant. We're thinking there particularly of Daniel Buring's recent work on alternative semantics, say, is an explicit formulation, a proposal for getting something like that with that kind of directionality. And we think you could use that in production, sort of using that as a filter the other way around. But there are also much more bidirectional models for this that actually basically take PF-LF pairs and sort of consider them in terms of their congruence. And so Krista's work has portions that are like that. Tanya Reinhardt's work in this area also had features like that. And so that would totally be compatible with the sort of program that we're pursuing here. The important thing is that under this view, really, I mean, in the F-less world, can't start with an annotation in the syntax that will then feed the phonology and the semantics. That we think would be really nice, but it seems like that might not be real. That's the point. Yeah.
Thank you. Martina Wolczko has a follow-up question.
Yeah, thank you. So it's partly you addressed it with the question that was just asked, but I have that question that I put in the post, but I'm not sure I fully agree with your answer. That, well, I'm sure I don't fully agree with it, because the way I would think about this is like an F as a feature is modifying things. It doesn't add things to the structure that then project. It just modifies a particular constituent, whereas the way you characterize the particle, it's a head that then projects, and it alters the structure of the spine. That's how I understand, the difference, and I don't see how one starts in the syntax and the other couldn't also start in the syntax. And then the crucial difference, what I've argued in my work and what I found empirically again and again, is that if you have a head, projecting, then the syntax is the thing that mediates the relation between form and meaning, sound and meaning. And so you get mismatches of the type that you're describing here. Whereas if you're a modifier, you don't have that syntactic head that can be the third factor. Well, not in the Chomskyan sense, but in my sense, so you have to. There's no expletive modifiers and there's no silent modifiers in my world, because you couldn't recover it if you just adjoin it. Then syntax doesn't tell you that there is something there, so there can't be any mismatches. So another way to ask this question is, couldn't it be possible that language that UG allows for both types, like a modifying what used to be an F feature type and a particle type, which is the head type? And what would you expect? How would languages differ? How would you diagnose that?
So, I mean, we could go, I think this could be resolved empirically, maybe by looking more at cases of secondary pied piping, right? So if there are languages that do have F in the syntax, you might expect them to treat focused elements and WH elements in just the same way for secondary fronting, or even do the inverse where only focused elements front and WH elements don't. That could be a world where you never place an F marker on WH elements, but do on things that are focused.
Wait, but I want to better understand the question, Martina, because are you worried about, F in the sense of an annotation on really the locus of alternatives, or are you worried about what we call the particle? I thought it was more the latter.
Yeah, I'm just not quite seeing the why is it that F requires 41 and the particle requires 42? Why couldn't the particle approach be like, okay, I'm inserting a particle in the syntax and it has an effect both on phonology and semantics? That is my main worry.
Yes. So what's the short answer for that? I think in large part it's it's due to the prevalence of these anti-pied piping type mismatches, right? Where it seems like at least there's a class of focus particles. It might not be all focus particles, but there's a class of focus particles across many languages that itself really doesn't have a particular relation with the focus in terms of the semantics. It's not saying the focus is in its complement or its complement, but instead it has to sort of be inserted someplace near the focus. But then, and then the semantics of the corresponding operator has to logically be sort of larger because the focus is logically larger, right? And then, I mean, going back to the point that, I thought one part that I thought was interesting in your question was then, is there optionality in the syntactic status of those particles as actually modifying the spine versus adjoining, for example, right? And how that affects the structure. And I think that's certainly an area that we want to think about much more in the future. And what it reminds me of is, I mean, essentially what we're calling particles here in this work totally builds on the Horvath and Cable sort of work on Q particles and Hagström for that matter, right? And so especially in Hagström's work, there's a lot of questions about variation in Q particles, Cable as well, and different options you could have for Q particles. When we look much more broadly at particles that may be overt or not, but delimit the syntactic targets of anything focused targeting, or maybe anything information structure targeting, looking at that behavior, we could be asking the same kind of questions. Are there head versions of it? Are there adjunct versions of it, et cetera? And that might be a way of thinking about different sort of syntactic responses to such phenomena too. I hope that sort of addressed your question.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I have to cut in. There are a few other questions, but we don't have time for them. But I invite you all to, after thanking our debaters, going over to this Discord channel where we can continue our discussion. So let's thank the debaters first of all, and then.
Thank you very much.